onto himself on his way to the nectar. Then he comes out, visits another flower of the same species, and as he comes in, rubs more pollen off on himself and rubs pollen from this flower onto the female part of the second flower. Now, each species of flower has a slightly different configuration of these parts. So it's entirely possible that these two species of monkey flower have the parts in different places. Okay? So maybe that's the other species of monkey flower. In this case, the insect comes in, but he never passes the female part and therefore never drops off the pollen. We would refer to this as a mechanical isolation because, in a sense, the mating is still occurring because we're still bringing pollen to that other plant. But because the arrangement of the reproductive parts is different, we're isolating these two populations from each other as separate species because the pollen can't get moved on to the female part if it comes from this other type of flower. Okay? Other examples of mechanical isolation, you could argue that a poodle and a Great Dane, even though they're members of the same species, they really aren't because there's a mechanical isolation that separates them. I don't think it's going to be possible, given the reproductive parts and the arrangement of them on a Great Dane and a poodle, that even if they want to mate together, it just isn't going to be possible for them mechanically to actually mate. In which case, that sounds like a mechanical isolation to me. The mating is still occurring, right? The dogs still want to mate, but they can't. The pollen is still being moved to the other flower type, but it's not being moved to the right part because of a mechanical issue. Okay? All right, gametic isolation. In gametic isolation, we've got individuals all producing gametes together at the same time. So to talk about this one, let's move to the ocean, and let's make this a coral reef in the ocean. Now, the way these marine species tend to operate is the male produces spermatozoa, the female produces eggs, fertilization happens, and I get a zygote. That zygote gets produced, and then it gets pulled away from the reef by the currents and the tides, and this zygote, as it develops into an embryo, will do that in the water column as it floats thousands of miles away from where it was produced. Okay? Now, probably because of predation, natural selection has selected for individuals that reproduce at times when the zygote is more likely to survive. So one of the ways to increase the survivorship of the zygote is to reproduce when there's no moon, right? There's no, the sky is much darker, which means it's harder for predators to find things to eat if they're using visual systems to do that. So a lot of these species are going to reproduce during a new moon. New moons are also a period of time where there's these extreme tides called spring tides, where you have a very high high and a very low low. And these species tend to reproduce as the tide is going out. Okay, so they're producing on an outgoing tide when there's no light, and there's this huge fluctuation in tidal volume. So because of that, all the species of fish and all the invertebrates all tend to reproduce at exactly the same time, an outgoing spring tide during the new moon. Is that okay? So the two species we have here of urchin, there's a purple urchin and a red urchin. They're members of two separate species. But because they're reproducing at the same time, right, there's always a possibility that the gametes will come together. So if this is the egg of the red, and that's the sperm of the red, and this is the egg of the purple, and the sperm of the purple, what's the mechanism that makes it so that this fertilizes that one and not this one, and this species fertilizes this egg but not that one? Because whatever that mechanism is, it's a gametic isolation mechanism. It's isolating the gametes so that they only come together within the same species. This one is not going to try to fertilize that one, and vice versa. Well, the thinking is that there are particular chemicals given off by these eggs. And the chemicals given off by them are unique to the species that produce the egg. And there should be a high concentration of that chemical close to the egg and a lower concentration much farther away. Okay? So what's happening is that this spermatozoan is swimming toward higher concentrations of the red chemical, whereas this one is swimming toward higher concentrations of the purple chemical. And if the sperm cells are only swimming toward a particular chemical type, then what's preventing mating with the other species, or sorry, what's preventing the formation of the zygote with the other species is movement toward a specific chemical type. So this chemotactic mechanism is the gametic isolation mechanism. I'm only swimming toward the chemical produced by eggs of my own species. Okay? All right, so these two are pre-mating or post-mating. Mating occurs, but you don't get the zygote. So they're post-mating pre-zygotic mechanisms. Right now, we're going to talk about three mechanisms where mating occurs, the zygote occurs, but you don't get a viable fertile offspring. Okay? So, the first one of these is called reduced hybrid viability. Reduced hybrid viability. In reduced hybrid viability, the offspring is called a hybrid. So whenever you take two species, and we're recognizing these parents as two species, and these two species come together to produce an offspring, at least in the animal world, we call this a hybrid. Okay? So the hybrid is the offspring between the two species. The hybrid's been produced, but what's wrong with it? It's got reduced viability. Well, what's viability? Via is life, so it has some issues, and the issues that it has are with survivorship. So the offspring has lower fitness than the parents, right? Reduced viability, that's reduced survivorship, that's reduced fitness. Okay? In this case, they talk about species of Encetina. They live in the same regions and habitats, and they occasionally hybridize. They occasionally come together and produce offspring. But most of the hybrids don't complete development. In other words, the zygote gets produced, divisions to produce the embryo, and then things start to go wrong, and most of these never finish development. And those that somehow manage to do it, they have lots of issues. They're frail, they have lousy survivorship. That means that these individuals are not likely to survive to produce their own offspring, so we maintain this kind of reproductive isolation mechanism We're preventing the two species from coming back together into one species. Okay? Right, if we've done reduced hybrid viability, then there's probably also a reduced hybrid fertility. Reduced hybrid fertility. Right, reduced hybrid fertility. In this case, the hybrid, the product of reproduction between two species, has reduced reproductive ability, which is the other half of the fitness. Reduced hybrid viability, problems with survivorship. Reduced hybrid fertility, problems with reproduction. Both of these are offspring produced with very low fitness. Best example, the horse and the donkey produce a mule. The mule is very robust, meaning it has great viability, but it has incredibly lousy reproduction, so we don't consider the mule to be the same species as the horse and the donkey. We consider those to be two species, the horse and the donkey, and then this hybrid that we call a mule. But because mules don't reproduce, we never go any farther. The horse and the donkey stay as two separate species. Okay. This next one is called hybrid breakdown. This is essentially like 6 and 7 put together. It only occurs in plants, and it's a very unusual case, not something I'm going to test you on because it is bizarre. But the idea is, instead of issues with survivorship and fertility showing up in the first generation with the production of the mule or the production of the salamander, it takes multiple generations. And each generation that occurs from this original mating, the offspring get worse and worse and worse. So here's the first parent, second generation, third generation, fourth generation doesn't make it. So it has hallmarks of both 6 and 7. It just takes more than one generation for this effect to play out. Okay? All right, reduced hybrid viability, reduced hybrid fertility, and hybrid breakdown are all post-zygotic mechanisms. These occur after the production of the zygote. But they're effective barriers to bringing the species back together again, and therefore these reproductive isolation mechanisms are all blocking the species coming back together again. It's allowing for the maintenance of those two separate species. Okay? All right, these tend to go along with allopatric speciation. Okay? Now, allopatric speciation means you have the first species, and then here something is happening in here. And what's happening in here are these reproductive isolation mechanisms. And these mechanisms are occurring because of those evolutionary forces that are working on these populations that have been separated from one another. Right? I could have a mountain range spring up because of the activity of tectonic plates. That could separate two populations of mice that used to be the same species, and then over lots and lots of time, genetic differentiation leads to the reproductive isolation mechanisms and eventually speciation. I would end up with two separate species than what I started with. Or ocean levels used to be a lot higher back during the Jurassic. Eventually the water receded, and you got this isthmus of Panama between North and South America. Right? That isthmus of Panama in there, that separated two populations of fish, and now they accumulate differences that lead to reproductive isolation. The idea with allopatric speciation is you need the physical separation coupled with genetic change over time, differentiation genetically being reinforced by the lack of migration, until eventually things are so different that the two groups cannot interbreed anymore. This process here takes a lot of time. It doesn't happen overnight. Our expectation is there should be a lot of species in the process of speciation. It's just going to take a few more thousand years. They got to accumulate some more of these mechanisms. Now, this other type of speciation is called sympatric speciation. In sympatric speciation, the speciation is going to happen in one location. It's going to happen in one spot. So what we need to do is somehow take a population and do something to it where instead of needing all of this time to pass with all of this stuff, instantaneously we have a new species. And something is going to happen in an instant that leads to the production of a new species. So what we'll talk about next time is sympatric speciation and how we can create species in a snap of a finger rather than having to wait tens of thousands of years. All right, so I'll see you next time. Take care.